Hello, everyone, and welcome to another lesson of Econ 202 of Microeconomics. My name is Yoav Vaxman, and I'm a professor of economics in the Royal College of Business at Coastal Carolina University. In this lesson, we're going to learn about consumer choices. Consumers have a lot of consideration when they make choices. They have to think about how much something is worth to them or its value, its price, and also the availability of substitute. So at the bottom left, we see somebody trying to balance value and price. Something more expensive may be more valuable, but the individual is facing budget constraint. And on the bottom right, we see a consumer making a choice between two possible soaps, which are two substitutes with similar characteristics. We're going to do the following in this lesson. We're going to explore how consumers make rational choices. When economists use the term rational, what they mean is that the individual is considering both the cost and benefits of their action. We're also going to examine the relationship between utility, which is the word economists use for enjoyment, demand, and prices. One of the concept we're going to look at is the idea that as you consume more and more of something, your marginal utility or additional utility from that product decreases. We're also going to look at consumers and how to try to maximize utility subject to a budget. Your budget is based on your available income, but also on the relative prices of goods. So if things become more expensive, even though your nominal income might be the same, your purchasing power, your ability to buy things will decrease. It will discuss how income and taste impact demand, and finally provide some examples of consumers' behavior. So at the bottom left, we have a picture of a yacht, and a yacht is something that's considered a luxury good. It's not something that most of us really need. However, individuals may decide to save money for a long time and sacrifice other goods in order to make a large purchase like a yacht if they're very passionate about boating. On the bottom right, we see a picture of a family on vacation. Vacation represents both a financial choice, but also a time choice. When we go on vacation, it means that we're not studying, we're not working, we're not doing the things that we normally do at home. So consumers both have to think about their finances, can they afford a vacation, and their time constraint, do they have the time to do it? If you look at consumer choice theory, there are a few basic premises that economists advocate. One is consumers aim to maximize satisfaction, what economists call utility, given their limited budget. So, of course, if we had unlimited budget, then we can buy just about anything, and we wouldn't have to worry about making these tough choices. However, even those who are very wealthy, like think about Jeff Bezos, still have to make some tough choices because they are also constrained by time. So Jeff Bezos decided to leave his job as the CEO of Amazon, a company he founded and grew, because he wanted to spend more time doing leisure activities. Each purchase decision reflects a trade-off between goods and services. Even free things require time. So if we decide to sit at home and read a book that we borrowed from the library, even though there's no financial cost to doing that, we're still giving up other leisure activity like watching a movie or perhaps working or studying. Marginal utility measure how the added satisfaction from one more unit. So drinking that first glass of orange juice is more enjoyable than drinking the second glass. And drinking that second glass of orange juice is more enjoyable than drinking that third glass. So the marginal utility measures the additional enjoyment from each glass that we drink. A rational consumer chooses goods that maximize utilities per dollar. So if we can measure utility as a unit, like say 40, right? The utility for dollars would be the amount of utility we get, let's say we pay for something that costs $4, like maybe getting a ice cream cone. We take 40 divided by 4, and you get utility of 10 units per dollar. And then we essentially subconsciously compare that to the utility for dollars of other things. So at the bottom center, we have a picture of the human mind, and we have to recognize that we have a limited amount of time per day, and during that time period, we have to work, send emails, talk to our colleagues, maybe play games, sleep, of course, have some leisure activities. So all of that has to fit in a given period of time. Therefore, all of choices, even if we don't pay for them with dollars, require a sacrifice or have an opportunity cost. And at the bottom right, this is represented using what we call a budget line. So here an individual is making a choice between bread and juice. This individual has $36 available to them, and they can buy up to 9 loaves of bread or 12 glasses of juice. Now, any point on the budget line is something that they can afford. Any point outside to the right of the budget line is not affordable. And if they consume inside the budget line, they can afford it and there's some income left, which means they're saving money. Let's explore the idea of marginal utility. Utility represents satisfaction or happiness derived from a good. Now, we don't really have a direct way to measure it, but we do recognize that our brain releases hormones like dopamine and oxytocin when we are satisfied. So increasingly, we can not only think about it theoretically, but we can actually put somebody on a brain scan and look at their brain activity to measure the level of enjoyment that they receive. The marginal utility decreases as we consume more unit. This is known as the law of diminishing marginal utility. To think about this, think about a day where you haven't eaten anything. Didn't have enough time for breakfast, didn't have enough money for lunch. Now it's 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and you're at a club meeting, and somebody brings in boxes of pizza, so you can eat as much as you want. Well, the first slice of pizza is going to be incredibly enjoyable because you're probably really, really hungry at this point. The second slice is going to be quite enjoyable, but not as enjoyable as the first one because now you're not starving anymore. When you get to the third slice, you are getting a little full. It's still enjoyable, but not enjoyable as the second. By the time you get to the fourth slice, you almost have to force yourself to eat it. So there's really no additional enjoyment in eating that fourth slide. And the fifth slide would actually decrease your enjoyment because now you're already full and might even give you stomach ache. So we can think of this in a graph. Here we have the total utility is that curvy black line on the top. The first slice of pizza gives us a lot of enjoyment. And if we can directly measure enjoyment, it looks like we're getting about 30 units of utility from that first slice. The second slice gives us a little bit less enjoyment, where we're getting 20 more units of utility. The third slice gives us even less enjoyment, and by the time we get to the fourth slice of pizza, our utility plateaus, which means it's as much enjoyment as we're going to get. And if we were to consume that fifth or sixth slice, our utility or enjoyment would actually decrease. We can also show this using the red line or the marginal utility line. So for the first slice, our marginal utility is quite high, 30. For the second, it's 20. For the third, it's 10. But when we get to the fourth slice, we're not really adding any more to utility because we're already full. And if we consume the fifth and sixth slice, our marginal utility would actually be negative. And that's true for almost any product. Think about coffee. That first cup of coffee in the morning helps you wake up, it builds up your energy, and has multiple health benefits, including increasing your stamina and helping your cardiovascular health. That second cup of coffee is still usually pretty enjoyable, but not nearly as enjoyable as the first. And by the time you get to the third and fourth cup of coffee, you start to get the jitters and you're actually reducing your utility. Now, we can use the idea of diminishing utility to look at the individual demand curve. As a reminder, the law of demand states that as price decreases, quantity demanded will increase. So demand is downward sloping. That's also true for individual. Individual demand curve reflect the diminishing marginal benefits from consumption. So if you look at the graph at the bottom, by looking at the one on the bottom left, this individual is getting a lot of utility from their first unit of consumption, but less utility from the second. Therefore, they're willing to pay $5 for the first unit, but only 4 for the second, and only 3 for the third, 2 for the first, and by the time they get to um, the time to continue their consumption, their initial utility eventually goes down to 0. For the second individual, we see the similar trend. So as they consume more and more, their additional marginal utility is decreasing. To get the market demand, we sum up all the individual demand for the consumers. So let's take the numerical example here. So here at a price of 5, the first individual is getting 8 units, the second individual might be getting about 10 units. So we add those two up and we get at the price of 5, 18 units. And we could do the same thing for price of 4, 3, and 2. So essentially, the market demand adds up horizontally all the individuals' demand. Now, in this example, we only have 2 individuals, but you can imagine an example with 3 or 4 or 5 individuals. Note that the individual demand curve tend to be pretty steep, where the market demand curve tend to be more horizontal. And the more individuals you have, the more horizontal that market demand is going to be. So for example, if you have different individuals and they all are willing to pay $2.50 for the first milkshake because it gives them a lot of pleasure, 2 for the second, and 3 for the third, if you had 3 individuals, that means the market demand would be 3 units for the first, 6 for the or 6 at $2, and 9 at $1.50. So again, the market demand is adding the individual demand at every single price. However, consumers can only consume so much because they are constrained by budget. Consumers face income limit that defines the possible consumption bundles that they can have. The budget line on the bottom left shows the combination of 2 goods that they can purchase. Of course, we know that as individuals, there are many different goods and services that we can purchase in a given day. So in a given day, you might buy different foods, you may get different drinks, you may use Lyft or public transportation, you may get your hair cut. But for simplicity's sake, we can only look at 2 goods when we look at a graph. So we could present this idea of a budget constraint by using a graph with 1 good on the vertical or y-axis and another good on the x-axis. The slope of the budget line equals the price ratio of the 2 goods, the price of X over the price of Y. Let's look at a specific example with burgers and pizzas as shown on the right. Suppose you had $24 in a given week to spend on food. The price of pizza was $6. Let's put pizza on the y-axis. The most pizza you could consume is 24 divided by 4, or divided by 6, which is 4 pizzas. However, burgers only cost $3. So if you spend all of your money on hamburgers, you can consume 24 divided by 3, or 8 hamburgers. Therefore, 4 is what we call the y-intercept, and 8 is what we call the x-intercept. And the slope of this budget line is simply 3, the price of the good on the x-axis, divided by 6. 3 over 6 is 1/2, but because this is downward sloping, we mark it as negative 1/2. What happens when prices and income change? When income rises, the budget line shifts outwards. So using the example from before, let's say our income increases from 24 to 36. What happens then? Well, the number of pizza you can buy increases from 4 to 6. You take 36 and divide it by $6, you get 6 units. The number of burgers increased from 8 to 12. Take 36 divided by 3 and you get 12. Therefore, both the y-intercept and the x-intercept shift forward, which can be shown as an overall shift to the right for the entire budget line. What happens, however, if the price of one of the goods changes? If the price of one of the goods increases, the budget line rotates inwards. If we look at the example in the bottom right, let's say that we had a budget of $24 as before, but the price of burgers increased from $3 to $4. The x-intercept will shift from 8 to 6 because 24 divided by 4 is 6. However, the y-intercept remains in the same place because the price of pizza is still the same. This would be an inward tilt in the budget line. By contrast, if the price of burger decreased, let's say to $2, we would see an outward tilt in the budget line. When the price of gas drops, for example, people drive and eat more. So we need to recognize that a decrease in the price of one good, for example, a decrease in the price of burgers, makes burgers more affordable, but it also releases some money we can use to buy other goods. Whereas an increase in the price of a product, particularly something we need, like gasoline, will constrain us and reduce our ability to buy all goods. Similarly, if we have inflation, it reduces our household purchasing power. So inflation represents an overall increase in prices, or if we look at the budget line, it means the entire budget line is shifting inwards. We can then break this into the substitution and income effect. The substitution effect leads people to choose cheaper alternative when prices rises. Look at the example of all the different clothes we can buy. For example, we can buy shoes from Adidas or we can buy them from Nikes. If the price of Nike shoes increases, some people may choose to switch to Adidas or New Balance. If the price of clothing from Zara increases, some people may choose to switch to H&M. This is known as a substitution effect. But there is also an income effect. The income effect reduces purchasing power, limiting our overall consumption when prices rises. Essential goods, which are things that we need, like groceries, which have few substitutes, tend to have a strong income effect. This includes things like electricity, which we all use, and we have to use it, and rent. If we look at the bottom right, we have the graph for rent increasing over time. So the side on the left showed the increase by decades, and we see a very gradual increase going all the way into the 1980s. And then we see a very sharp increase in the 1990s, kind of flattening out. But really, the interesting trend is what happened after COVID-19. We saw a big surge in rent going from just over $1,000 to over $1,500 per rent in a period of 5 years. And this made it very difficult for people because they have to live somewhere. And particularly if they're lower income families, they tend to pay rent, and the rent increases constrain their ability to buy other things as well. So when the rent goes up, they may have to go out less, buy less fresh food, maybe buy more processed food, and make other adjustments. Opportunity cost is one of the most important concepts in economics. We recognize that there are relative prices, and they measure the cost of one good relative to other goods. This is known as the marginal rate of transportation, and as noted before, it's the slope of the budget line, which is the price of the X over the price of Y. It shows a trade-off between goods and the consumer's budget. Opportunity costs reflect what consumers have to give up when choosing one good. Example, if you spend money on streaming, it may reduce the amount of money available to go out. So One of the reasons people go out less is because they have more movies available at home. But the other reason is if they pay more for streaming, they have less money available to go out. So we see both the substitution and income effect in play here. Non-monetary costs like the time also affect consumers' choices. So the illustration on the bottom left shows you the choice between time and money. We can work harder and potentially make more money, but it also means giving up time. And at the bottom right, we see the choice that individuals typically make over their lifetime. When we're young, we have to often borrow money because we're in college and we're not making a lot of money, maybe working part-time. We have a lot of expenses like our tuition, and we end up oftentimes accumulating debt. As we get a full-time job, we borrow less and less and start saving. Sometimes, usually in our 50s, our saving peaked and start decreasing. And as we move to retirement, we start dis-saving, which means we use our savings in our 401k or individual retirement account to finance our consumption. The pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, had a very interesting effect on people's consumption patterns. During the lockdown, people shifted to delivery and online services. So we saw a huge surge in things like DoorDash and Grubhub delivering food. We also saw people buying a lot more fast food because they can go up to the window and buy it and didn't have to go into a restaurant where they had to worry about contracting the virus. And we saw a huge rise in DoorDash, Zoom, and other digital services. Fast food chains thrived during the pandemic, while a lot of small restaurants struggled, and many of them had to close down. So, generally speaking, we substitute online good for in-person experience. And we saw just in the year 2020, when the pandemic started, we saw the sale of e-commerce rise from 209 to 269 billion in a very short period of time. This trend, of course, continued after the pandemic, and we see more and more services like delivery.com, Zomato, and restaurants creating their own delivery service like Domino's after the pandemic occurred. We economists also have some behavioral insight based on consumer theory. Consumers' preference evolve around trends, technology, and social norm. So I remember 10 years ago, a lot of people went to buy yogurt ice cream. And now most of these have disappeared. Yoga pens are now very much in trend, but we might see them disappear in the future as well. So we see things come and go. I know when I was in high school, a lot of people were riding skateboards, and now we barely see them. And that's called trends. But technology also has tremendous influence on our behavior. So behavioral economics studies how emotion and biases affect decision. People sometimes deviate from what we call rational thinking. So they do things that may not benefit them in the long run, and sometimes even things that don't benefit them immediately. Marketers use behavioral insight to influence choices. For example, we see people buying luxury goods, even though they give them limited pleasure, just for status. We also see people making choices based on social influence. So a trend we've seen in the last 15 years with the development of social media is people just filming themselves, buying things and using product, and then trying to convince other people to buy it. It's a very odd phenomenon because you don't know these influencers. They're not really your friends. They're not in the social circles, but we tend to follow their advice because what we call social proof. We do what other people do. So there are different determinants of demand. Demand depend on prices, income, taste, and expectations. Government can also influence those demand through taxes and policy changes. Take the example of cigarettes. So the graph on the bottom right shows you the decrease in demand for cigarettes from about 425 billion spent to 307 over the course of one decade. And the trend is driven by a couple of things, but one of them is a rising tax on cigarette a very clever campaign by the government to try to dissuade people from using cigarettes, and also regulation like no smoking in public places that makes it more difficult to smoke. Social trend like sustainability also affect what we buy. And finally, there's just this general trends in society. For example, one of the trends that I've noticed in recent years is all these sugar shops, like it's sugar. I remember the first time one of these shops opened in my city, Myrtle Beach, it was something novel. And now these shops are in multiple locations, and we see tremendous growth in the consumption for very sugary and honestly very expensive sweets. So to summarize what we learned that consumers maximize satisfaction by balancing utility and budget constraint. Demand is something that is driven by the diminishing marginal utility, where the market demand is a summation of all the individual demand. Changing prices leads to income and substitution effect, and real-world event like inflation or technology shift alter demand patterns. So look at a few technology shift. I remember when Segway first came out, that's the picture in the bottom middle, a lot of people thought that people going to stop walking anymore and instead use Segways to go everywhere. But that trend didn't happen. Smartwatches, which seem extremely appealing, have not been seen any widespread. So sometimes it's really difficult to predict what consumers will want and what they won't want, and what will become widespread and what will become something of a novelty. For instance, consider virtual reality. Is this just a short-term trend, or are we all going to be highly engaged in the virtual world in the future? So here's some discussion question. What are the benefits and harm to shifting to an e-commerce society? Think particularly about the impact for the environment and society. Think of all the waste we're creating when we have to package things and drive them long distances to have them delivered to our home. What is the role of virtual reality in our future? Should we regulate our use of VR? So at the bottom right, we have a picture from Ready Player One, where the world outside is very miserable, and people spend as much time as they can in a virtual world called Oasis. What strategies do firms use to get us to buy more things? And should we regulate some of these strategies? So I thank you for joining me today. My name again is Yoav Waxman, and today we learn about consumer choices. I hope you join me for some of our future session, and I wish you a wonderful day.